We're going to be looking at the application of your textbook. I hope all of you finished reading the material that we had assigned to you, because you will need it to be able to understand the material we're covering in this module. And hopefully as the result of being able to review this material in the module, as well as what you've done in reading the textbook, you will be able to do policies and procedures for trust. The reason is that, quite honestly, that's going to be a responsibility for anyone who is a investment advisor working with a trustee, or if you're working as a trustee. In many cases, even if you're advising a client about the trust as to what their investment policies should be. So at the end of this module, you'll be able to, first of all, understand the steps in implementing a trust under the Prudent Investment Rule that's in effect in 48 states. List the documents that are minimally required. Understand the necessity of keeping the beneficiaries aware of the latest status. Explaining the 18-step process for monitoring an investment account. I guess the best way to start is, again, reminding everybody compliance to due diligence, knowledge, and experience requirements, which are very basic to being a trustee or a someone assisting a trustee as an investment advisor. First of all, we establish a policy monitoring system, and it covers the investment portfolio and all the investments in the trust. If we lack knowledge, our experience is delegated to qualified persons documenting the basis for selection. We need periodic analysis, review, rebalancing, and documentation of the status of all of the investments. And finally, prepare objective periodic reports for beneficiaries covering the task. Some beneficiaries may be expecting it weekly, some monthly, some quarterly, some annually. I think quarterly is reasonable. When they do it weekly or monthly, it's the same thing as the individual who looks at the stock market every day to see where his stock stands. He's so busy seeing trees, or she's so busy seeing trees, that they don't see the forest. So best to keep it, if possible, quarterly or annually. Again, documentation is involved in all of these policy matters. Trustee lacking experience or knowledge investments. Remember, the original rules were that the trustee had to take the responsibility and do the investments. And today, under the Prudent Investment Rule, we've changed it. We want to have qualified registered investment advisors or certified financial analysts to submit proposals for investment duties called out in the trust. Now, there are other people obviously qualified. However, for purposes of what I would call being able to document that you've done the best job you can, the person should have a title of RIA or CFA, so that it gives the credibility for the job they're doing and shows that they have the experience and the training. I've had one trust where they had me do it, and quite honestly, I'm not a CFA. I wasn't a registered investment advisor at the time. But I had taught investments, and I really felt that I was not really appropriate for what they needed, because I didn't really have the experience that would be provided by these two types of individuals. Next, you review the experience, background, and fees towards choosing the one that's most appropriate for the trust. And finally, you have to document a decision on who you picked. The best way of putting it is you're looking for the best value you can get. Sometimes it's an offset of, do I want more experience, which is going to cost me more, or will I take less experience and cost me less? And a lot has to do with the factors of the trust. When we look at the policy, is the risk taking very high, or is it a very conservative trust? Are the assets in the trust that are already there achieving the objectives or not? All of these will impact the experience you need. The periodic reviews. We have to prepare written reports obtained from the investment advisor on a periodic basis, information recovering the following. And before I get to them, again, remind you, you are probably going to have to nag, and I hate to say it, but harass to get these reports, even on a quarterly basis. Sometimes these people chew off bite off more than they can chew, and therefore they aren't going to be able to be timely. I see that as a tax preparer doing trust taxation, that it's not uncommon for the information to come in 2-3 months late. So you really have to keep after them. And so let's go over what it covers. First of all, how the fiduciaries to the goals of the trust and needs of the beneficiaries are being met, and how the listing of the portfolio assets, which should be an easy part. Recommend changes to balanced portfolio and change investments not meeting goals, and that's a little bit more challenging. Of course, the first one's the most challenging. The goals of the trust and needs of the beneficiaries being met. How do you prove that? And finally, the efforts being taken to minimize fees consistent with the goals of the investment portfolio. And that is a lot of times lip service, because you really have many times no control over what the costs are, especially if you're dealing with mutual funds and some of the stocks and that are tied into, say, through a portfolio account. Reports to the beneficiaries. This is something that's very important. Again, in the real world, it's many times very late, and I think there's been a lot of trustees getting problems for that. In fact, the beneficiaries have taken the trustee to court, got them replaced, and sometimes had them pay fines because they didn't comply in a timely manner. What you got to do is reach agreement on what periodic reports means. Is it, again, quarterly, yearly, monthly, daily, whatever? And it covers the actions taken to meet the financial goals of the trust. In other words, what's been done since the last reporting, and a detailed accounting of actual assets and the performance versus goals of the trust. Again, I do this for my clients when I was practicing, even though I wasn't a trust and I was giving advice, and I was able to use things like Vanguard, Morningstar, Schwab, who gave me all the information I need. So it was a matter of sitting down and focusing for half an hour on one of those three, and getting the information I needed to write the report. It's just a matter of sitting down, taking the time. Establishing the investment plan. There's the 18 steps that are recommended, and I would suggest you really look at the instructor's notes that I provide each week, because it has more detail on it that you really need to see. First of all, you have to establish a monitoring system for complying with the written investment policy. You have to hold periodic documentation meetings with the investment advisor and obtain monthly statements from them. Risk parameters should be established in the trust's written objectives. Measure the advisor's performance against appropriate market indices and objectives of the trust. And again, the problem for me would be how to determine which market indices I'm going to be measuring them against. Is it the S&P? Is it the Dow Jones? Is it some other? For example, we had a client who trust required all the money to be spent in the biotech area, and that tends to be an area that has a lot of volatility and very few index checks I could check, because you had to find which particular items fell into the biotech area as he defined it in his trust policy. And that made it more complicated. So every time I wrote it up, I had to write up a definition of what my understanding it was. Identify investment goals, investments, ensure that the trust investment goals are clearly stated and meet the goals and needs of the beneficiaries. If doubt, obtain a clarification from the trust attorney. Ensure that the investment portfolio is consistent with the goals of the trust, and continuously rebalance and monitor the investments. Number 5 is set parameters in investment policy and verify that the advisor stays within these constraints. Establish quality ratings for investments in the investment policy. For example, do they have to be 4 or 5 star, and what is you use? Because Morningstar and say Schwab give different answers. If annual turnover portfolio exceeds the norm, determine reasons and measure the cost benefit. And that gets interesting because it's nice theory, but it's very difficult in the practical world. And finally, on this chart, determine the short versus long-term capital gains and measure tax efficiency of the overall portfolio. I don't mean to laugh on some of this, but when I've done it in the past, I found it to be much more difficult than I ever expected it to be. Number 9 is look for unusual patterns or variations from investment policies concerning maturity, duration, schedules, and credit ratings of fixed income securities held. And again, the information is readily accessible. Look for change of industry sectors from investment policy. And 11, determine if results indicate the trustee taking greater risk than is suitable for the trust. Again, that's a subjective, unless you have a very detailed definition. And if you got a very detailed definition, you'll probably be arguing with the investment advisor as to what did you really mean to say by it. So I like to keep it as simple as possible. Determine if the trust is adequately diversified. Determine if advisor's holdings reflect earnings ratios that are inappropriate for the risk tolerance of the trust. Monitor holding period of securities to determine if it's too conservative, and determine the marketability of the trust portfolio vis-a-vis the needs of the trustee of the trust. 16 is you're beginning, I guess, to see how much work is involved in this. Determine if leverage is being used, if it should be used, and if so, is the advisor acting prudently and leveraging the portfolio? If the trust policy statements allow the derivatives and the manager is using them, determine if the advisor has the ability to manage them and comply with limits set forth in the trust. Measure the manager's investment performance results against the degree of risk being taken, determine if the latter is justified. Before we get to the summary, I would just like to say that this is done after the fact on what the advisor did, and it's always easier after the fact rather than before the fact to come up with comments that may not be positive. So I try to always work with the advisor when I was doing trustee work to make sure that it wasn't becoming a Monday morning quarterback. And I also tried to recognize that many of these terms mean different things to different people, such as the term risk and how much risk the trust allows, because generally the trust doesn't do a very good job at describing anything. It's up to really the trust policy, and the trust policy is a very challenging document to make. It requires the exact goals of the trustee and being able to understand if the trustee really understands what the goals are, and therefore it means it's a lot of work on the part of an investment advisor or a trustee with the grantor to make sure it's handled. So let's go over what this module covered. The need for documentation in all aspects, as you probably figured out before we even started. The need to verify what the trust authorizes. And again, you probably seen up those steps obviously mean that there's got to be a lot of documentation for those steps to be applicable. The need for a conservative set of documentation, and the need for a standard checklist. And I think that the 22 we had there would be an excellent checklist.